Ron Baugh, I want to welcome you to this discussion about leadership. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Ron. It's just great to have you with us.
My absolute pleasure, John.
I'm going to embarrass you here for a second. I'm going to do a quick intro so that everybody that is watching and listening knows something more about you. They might have already checked you out on LinkedIn, but I've known Ron for quite some time now. Ron, we go back 6-7 years now, and Ron is leading 2 CEO peer groups with CEO Global Network and mentors a large number of CEOs. And Ron is also the president of CEO Global Network. But the thing that I want to highlight to people is you grew up flipping hamburgers, Ron. And if anybody goes to your LinkedIn site, they're going to see right under your name and right under where you say CEO Global Network, they're going to see that you are a hamburger fan. I mean, how many barbecues do you have, Ron?
My wife's listening. I think I have 6 now, but I'd have to do a check.
When he was growing up flipping hamburgers, it was at Weber's, and Weber's charcoal broiled hamburgers on Highway 11 north of Aurelia, right, Ron? And you grew up in that area, and you just loved that work. You kind of found something that you just really enjoyed from a young age, eh?
Well, that's right, John. I started there as very young. I started there in 1978, and I credit Weber's for sort of formulating my business career and my personal value system. It was, 17, 18 years old. Sometimes life's a little confusing, and you're not maybe going down the right paths. And Weber's was a place that straightened you out a bit, and I'm very appreciative for that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the lessons you learned from Mr. Weber. I know you call him Mr. Weber. I mean, you went on to become the director of operations at Weber's, right, didn't you?
That's
and then went on to lead some national brands who are renowned also for their burgers. You ran Wendys Canada. You ran Harvey's as well, and I'm sure you took lessons from Mr. Weber into those roles, eh? And when you were at Wendys, you had the opportunity of working with Dave Thomas, and he is famous for what he accomplished with Wendys from the ground up, really. And so you had an opportunity to work with a couple of tremendous entrepreneurs, tremendous leaders, tremendous people. And so if you had to boil down your number one learning from Mr. Weber, what would that be?
Well, there's so many, John. It's hard to think of one, but the one that comes to mind when you ask the question is Mr. Weber believed in doing the best you absolutely could. Serve the best product, make sure your shoes are shined. He was an advocate for quality, and quality in relationships, quality in product, in service. He was a very humble man, but he had very high standards. He just knew that he loved having the best of the best. And it doesn't matter if it's a hamburger or a milkshake or a white shirt you're wearing to work. It's got to be pressed, and it's got to be the best. So I learned about how to try your best at everything you do. And I don't know if that's too general a piece of feedback, but that's what I walk away and think of when I think of Mr. Weber.
I mean, that is a leadership lesson. I mean, it's really around professionalism in all you do, isn't it? Like, a high bar. I also heard you use the word humility, a humble guy. And how important is that in terms of leadership?
It's very important. For years, the term Weber's was something the customers came up with. It was called charcoal broiled hamburgers, and very small letters underneath, as a proprietor in the 60s would, you put Paul Weber, because that's what a proprietor did. But he'd answer the telephone, charcoal broiled hamburgers. He would never say his name. The word Weber's finally in the 70s, the sign went up that said, Weber's. But that wasn't his doing. That was others that did that.
And so then when we think about Dave Thomas and what he accomplished at Wendys, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about his background in terms of his journey. But if you had to boil down one nugget from him, what would it be?
Well, of course, I worked much more closely with Mr. Weber than I did with Dave Thomas, but I'd met Dave, and certainly his imprint on the company was everywhere. So if you didn't know him, you felt like you knew him. But I had met him a number of times, and I still carry a card in my wallet from him with his legacy values. But the one that sticks out with me, and again, it sounds simple when you say these things, John, because they can sound like platitudes, but Dave was big on doing the right thing. So when we were faced with big decisions, we always knew that if we did the right thing, we'd get supported. Even if it was controversial or cost money, It was do the right thing when challenged as a leader. And that's something that we kept very close to our hearts.
That's great counsel, isn't it? That was part of the culture that he built. Just do the right thing.
There wouldn't be a senior executive in the organization that couldn't recite the 5 legacy values. They didn't have to be on a wall, or they were imprinted, and because we believed in them, like they were something that you would say, yeah, I can get behind those. Those are values that I live my life by. So it wasn't a stretch. It was not a stretch to sort of adopt those and share those with your teams.
So the values came off the wall and right into the people that were part of the organization, and they embraced them, right?
That's right. They very much embraced them and celebrated them. We revisited them all the time, John. They were live, and they would be today as well. I can guarantee you. I've been gone a long time, but I'll swear to you right now that there's active today as they would have been the day that he opened his restaurant.
That's quite an accomplishment, isn't it? But from both those gentlemen, they both accomplished that. People walk the talk all the time and embrace them, and just they were totally integrated into who they were, right?
I would have loved to have those two men meet. One's running a 7,000 unit chain, and one's running a hamburger stand north of Aurelia, which he used to call it, a hamburger stand.
Yeah.
But they had shared many similar qualities, and I think they would have liked each other quite a bit. Never did happen.
Which brings me to this question, Ron. Was there a trait, sort of a characteristic of both these gentlemen that they shared?
Yeah. Both were extremely humble. And both were extremely generous. And I don't just mean financially, John. I mean generous with their time, generous with listening to your challenges, generous. The Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption was a massive organization that Dave put together to help kids who find forever homes. And Mr. Weber was one of the most generous people I ever met in many, many ways, including financially. We were paid, John, extremely well, but we worked very hard as well. So it was a very great two-way street. And as a young kid trying to put yourself through university, it was a real bonus for us to be able to work there and try and save enough money during the summer to be able to pay for your university in the winter.
How are their leadership styles different? Were their leadership styles different? I mean, were you close enough to Dave to really get a look at that?
I think I was close enough to get some, we had a senior meeting in Las Vegas after a convention. So all the officers of the company stayed back for a meeting post-convention. And we were having a strategy session, and Dave walked in unexpectedly. And it's a bit like a rock star, the senior guys worked with him right closely, but we all, we saw him a couple of times a year. So he asked us what we were working on. And of course there was PowerPoints, and there was, diagrams and sketches and strategic plans. And he looked around, not impressed at all. He said, are you talking about the quality of hamburgers at all? Of course we weren't. We weren't. And he said, don't you think we should get this group together that perhaps you should talk about how to serve a better hamburger? And just that kind of humble, customer forward, and keeping what's important. And I remember that comment. I don't remember anything else about that meeting, but I remember that comment, and it stuck with me for the rest of my career.
That's very interesting. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about Dave's generosity. Can you just talk a little bit about how the generosity that both these gentlemen had as part of their character?
Yeah, I can. Sometimes I think the generosity is an underutilized asset for a CEO. They were naturally generous. They looked for and found ways to show their appreciation for what you did. And Dave had a program that was developed with the senior team called an MBA program. But it wasn't the MBA that you would think of. You get a pin and an award for a mop bucket attitude. So sort of as you said earlier, roll up the sleeves and do that. Mr. Weber would write you thank you notes on your paycheck, send you notes at Christmas. And in both organizations, I always felt that my work didn't go unnoticed and I felt appreciated. And so I think you end up giving back as hard as you can to make sure you don't disappoint.
Well, absolutely. Would you call both these leaders inspirational?
Absolutely, but neither one of them would have described themselves as inspirational. They were extremely inspirational to me and many, many others. But neither one of them would have put that forward as one of their characteristics. That was the way they were. But it was not a false kind of, I'm going to go out today and be inspirational at all. They went out and followed a value system that we were all attracted to, and were extremely inspirational to a lot of people, franchisees, employees, customers, suppliers. I mean, it's not just the people that work there. And so, yeah, I think they both were extremely.
When I think of Weber's, and when I think of Wendys, I think of quality. And you mentioned Dave coming into that post-conference meeting with the execs and zeroing in on that. Can you give us a couple other examples about how quality was so important for both of these people?
Dave's famous for saying quality is our recipe. He would say that a lot. And the reason the hamburgers are square is because we don't cut corners. They're funny, but they actually resonate big time within the organization. And Mr. Weber would ask suppliers, they'd come and say, you know, we can sell you this ice cream for $20, and he'd say, that's really good. What could you sell me for $25? You know, like he would turn it around and say, if that's pretty good, but I want the best ice cream you can make me. And if that means I need to spend a little more money, I'm happy to do that. So most people would be asking for the $20 tub for $18. But he's saying, hey, how about 25 for that? What can you do? And we had a small ice creamery that did just that for us back in the day when we launched ice cream. So both had that front and center quality. You know, everything at Wendy's is done freshly. The meat is fresh. The salads are made in the back of the house. It's not prepackaged. The chili's made in-house. And for a quick service chain, that's very unusual. And it causes a lot of supply chain challenges to do that properly, but they think it's worth it. And I think the customer would agree.
Yeah, for sure. This is part of our global leadership training program, is finding, attracting, and keeping A players. It sounds to me like both of these leaders attracted and kept and inspired high-performing people. How did they do that?
Well, that's a really good question. In Mr. Weber's case, he felt that if he had a good employee, that he'd want to talk to the brother and the sister of that employee or the best friend of that employee. He felt that good people would bring good people. So he was big on having people refer. In Wendy's case, the reputation of the organization is so strong that people are attracted to it. And the Dave Thomas story, even for those who never met him, it'd be embraced by people who are starting their very first day there today. That's the power of that culture.
You know, you hear a lot about emotional intelligence today, right? And it's a big part of our curriculum. How would you think they would comment on emotional intelligence? And they may not call it that, but emotional intelligence has been around as long as people have been on this earth.
Well, it's a good question. With respect to Mr. Weber, who I had more time with one-to-one, terrific listener. Just a terrific listener. And we would go on. I mean, at 17 years of age, John, we would go on about stuff that probably he wasn't that interested in. You know, he was in his 60s, but he would give us the time of day. Dave Thomas, when he visited a restaurant, he wouldn't consider himself a celebrity, but the staff did. And he would walk by the welcoming line of senior officials, of senior executives at the door, walk right past them to the heart of the kitchen to say hi to the employees, right? It wasn't he was rude to the executives, but his intentions were very clear. He wanted to make sure that those people knew he thought they were important. So those small gestures were really important and were just illustrations of how they thought and how they presented themselves to the general public.
Yeah, for sure. And they both put the customer front and center, didn't they? I mean, they knew the customer extremely well and focused on making sure that customer was taken care of, right?
Yeah, Dave Thomas said you don't stir chili with a pencil. So as much as we need to be financially responsible, run businesses, it's about the customer and service and making sure they get value. And if that means replacing something because it wasn't quite right, well, you go ahead and do that. And don't worry about the cost of that. You got to make sure the customer's looked after, because they'll come back and back and back again. And that was clear in both organizations.
Yeah, that would be. You know, you've got a great article on LinkedIn on the 10 lessons learned from flipping burgers, right? And you mentioned in there, it's around paying attention to the details, be proud of every aspect of your business. And you want to just expand on that, because they both felt that was very important, didn't they, Ron?
Yes, well, and thank you for mentioning the article. I appreciate that. They did. Weber's had outdoor dining. We had picnic tables, and those things were painted every year and were cleaned in between every use. The paint we used was a high-end paint that was a bit glossy, and how you paint your picnic tables was a big deal. And Wendy's had a very strong food safety and cleanliness program that we all adhere to. So we take that pretty seriously, and Wendy's was terrific. They had first in class systems. They still do today, and we benefited from that.
Is there a quote that you'd like to share with us from Mr. Weber? And then I'll ask you the same question about Mr. Thomas.
Well, that's a good one. I can tell you a very quick story. We had a 30th anniversary that we put together, and Mr. Weber came up, and some of the kids that worked there had never met him before. He was in his 80s. And we had a little celebration, and on the way out, I asked him how he thought it went, and he said it was okay. He was generally more positive. I said, what's wrong? And we had themed it 30 years of service. And he was not a very critical man. He said he didn't like that because it wasn't about us. It was about the customer. So we were celebrating ourselves,
Yeah,
30
yeah.
years of service. And he said, no, you've got it backwards. It's 30 years of them. You'd be nothing without them. That's stuck with me. I mean, that was 30 years ago. I had that conversation. And back to Dave Thomas, one of the things he taught us is to treat everyone with respect. And I think that is something that we can all do a better job on and try very hard every day to follow those kind of role models that they have. And John, quite frankly, I'm grateful to have had the opportunities I've had. A kid from early at Flipping Hamburgers, it was able to parlay that into a career. The most surprised individual in the world was me. And so very grateful for that leadership and hope to pass along some of that to some of our members.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. I really appreciate you being with us today and sharing your lessons learned from these terrific leaders. They would be proud of you, Ron. You care about people. You care about the customer. You are a servant leader. Between the three of you, we're learning from three outstanding people. And I want to thank you for that, Ron. This was outstanding.
It was my absolute pleasure and an honor to be part of this today. Thank you for inviting me on to the program.